welcome to French history. So before you start this lesson, make sure you have got your clear and quiet workspace. You will need your worksheet either printed off or to fill in electronically. You might want your textbook, you might want some coloured pens, and you will need sound for the clips. Okay, so continuing our work on Napoleon's empire and life in the empire, we're going to be looking today at the French economy. How prosperous was the economy under Napoleon? Okay, so we're going to re-explain the reasons why the economy was so problematic by the late 18th century in France, looking at a comparison between France and Britain. We're going to then recap and describe the financial policies of the governments that have been in France since the Ancien regime and during the Revolution as a bit of a revision, and thinking about the issues that Napoleon is inheriting. And then we're going to look at what Napoleon does with his economic policies and think about what successes did he have. Okay, so there's going to be quite a lot of me talking in this lesson because it's quite a complex topic and it needs a lot of explaining. But I will prompt you to complete the tasks as we go through. Okay, so the first thing I want you to do is to brainstorm on your worksheet any ideas that you've got about the context of the French economy by 1800. Okay, so mainly, why did states, particularly Britain, have the advantage over France when it came to the economy? What was it about Britain by the late 18th century that meant they were so prosperous economically? Can you just pause the video now and spend a few minutes brainstorming any ideas you've got from your prior knowledge? Okay, so we're going to talk through a few ideas, so keep adding to your worksheet as you listen to the following. Now obviously this is a huge topic, there's so much you could say on this, and historians clearly don't agree on the reasons why the Industrial Revolution happened in Britain, but it clearly did happen in Britain, and it happened in Britain at the expense of mainland Europe and the expense of Asia, countries like China as well. Okay, so before you had the Industrial Revolution, you had to have an agricultural revolution beforehand because you needed to be able to free up the population from agriculture in order to fuel industrialisation. So the fourth course crop rotation system invented in Norfolk was part of the reason that this was able to take place. On the right hand side here you can see the sort of drawing of a medieval manor, which you can see strip farming take place, where each resident of the manor, each peasant would basically have their own strip, and that would be rotated every year. And this was subsistence farming. Okay, this was lots of people doing farming on a very small scale, and it was required a lot of manpower. It was non-mechanised, wasn't it? So when you had crop rotation system, you had higher yields from agriculture, and that meant that you could ultimately free up some people from farming, didn't it? Now this was also accompanied by enclosure. So you can see on this picture as well, on the right hand side, that you've got common land and pasture land. Now enclosure that happened in Britain in the 17th and 18th centuries also meant that common land that the peasants had rights to was taken, and this was all amalgamated into larger farms. So when that happened, these larger farms, which became more mechanised, and parts of the farm became arable as well, so they didn't even have crops on them. They were for other products like animals, pasture, and meat and cheese. That meant that you had a sort of surplus amount of people, didn't you? So those people are going to still need to earn a living, and they're going to start going into towns and later on cities in order to do so. This larger scale farming was accompanied by things such as better irrigation, selective breeding. All of these things were improving farming and made the farm owners richer, wealthier landowners, and that in turn meant that they were consumers themselves. So this was driving the change in the economy in Britain. Now, alongside that, alongside the change in the economy and the industrialisation, we have a transport revolution going on. So this, we think of the railways, but that's much later. That's a sort of mid-19th century, early mid-19th century phenomenon, really. We did have, as we'll see in a minute, the first use of coal in the 18th century, but really it was the canals in the 18th century that we're looking at in terms of how we're transporting agricultural produce and things that are being made in factories around the country. Now, France, coming back to the previous discussion we had about agriculture, France hadn't gone through the same process of creating larger, more mechanised industry and crop rotation. They had introduced some crop rotation in some areas of France, but it wasn't universal at all. And as we will see from the changes that were introduced in the revolution, when a farm was when a landowner died, the farm was divided between sons. Okay, so that system of partage was actually carried on in Napoleonic France, but that only served to continue to allow these small kind of subsistence levels farms to take place. Now, similarly, in France, in terms of transport, there was a very good road network. Remember the Corvée Royale, which was part of the feudal dues that the peasants or the third estate had to pay to the government. But they don't have a really well-developed system of canals that they have in Britain by 1800. And this was really important because actually this was a much more efficient way to transport. You can see from the statistics here, transport goods and produce than it was to have them all being pulled by carts and horses along roads. And another important aspect of this is the free market. So in Britain there was a free market. There was no tolls or customs barriers, and we said before how this was a large problem in France, the fact that it was very fragmented because of the nature of the way that France had been created as a state, with lots of different areas added at various times, which had negotiated their own feudal arrangements, the pays d'état. There was lots of protectionism going on internally. Well, this doesn't happen in Britain, and that meant that the free market was able to prosper. So linked to this obviously is urbanisation. So feudalism had sort of disappeared in Britain by the end of the 17th century because of the disputes between Crown and Parliament that you're studying on the British side of the course. And this meant that, people had a lot more freedom to go where they wanted and to kind of, seek jobs wherever they felt like it. Feudalism, we know, only came to an end in the French Revolution during 1789 with the Great Fear and the August 4th decrees. So this idea that you're sort of tied to the land and your feudal obligations is only going to suppress the economy and keep it very backwards and very agricultural and very traditional, isn't it? So because you had these, people freed up from land and freed up from agriculture, you see urbanisation going on, and this urbanisation means that you're getting huge population growth in cities, and that population, that ready supply of labour, is obviously important for things like factories and mass production of goods. Another really important aspect of this is that you can see from the graph on the right hand side is that energy was much cheaper in Britain than it was in anywhere else. Okay, so Amsterdam wasn't too far behind, and the Netherlands is another really well-developed economy in the 17th and 18th centuries. But the coal industry was driving the industrialisation. The urbanisation was driving the industrialisation in Britain as well. And the price of energy in Paris, as you can see from the graph here, is very high in comparison, which means that industrialisation is not as lucrative, is it? In Britain as well, we also have inventions such as the spinning jenny. Okay, so that means again that you can be more productive, can't you? You can create lots of produce with one machine. It would take hand looms and hand weavers much longer, and therefore be much more expensive to produce. The steam engine, as we talked about, and the first factories were appearing in the mid to late 18th century, and this is, these are the kind of the things that are really crucial in driving industrialisation and making industrial products cheaper, and therefore lots of them were able to be exported to other countries, which meant trade, which again put money into the pockets of entrepreneurs and industrialists. So you can see from the map here on the top right the British trade routes between 1750 and 1800s, and you can see that there's huge amounts of British trade with North America and the colonies, and there's also huge amounts of British trade going around the bottom of the Cape of Good Hope and into the English colonial possessions in India. So, you know, British colonies, the British Empire was still in its early stages in the 18th century, but British colonies were widespread across the world and gave markets to all these industrial products. And as we've talked about before, the early 18th century saw a whole sort of range of conflicts, colonial conflicts between Britain and France, ultimately with the aim of securing colonial markets overseas. And many of these, including the 7 Years' War, where France lost entirely their possessions in North America, as we'll see on the map in a minute, except for Louisiana, which they then gave to Spain, and they lost Canada as well, meant that French colonies were decreasing, and they didn't have the export markets and they didn't have these natural resources, products such as tobacco and sugar, in order to sell to their own citizens. So we know as well that the French Revolution hadn't been very helpful for that, because they didn't actually the colonists or the Americans didn't actually stop trading with Britain after that as a result of that, even though France had supported them. And not only that, but in 1791 in Saint-Dominique, this was France's richest colony, there was a massive slave revolt, and this meant that they became the Empire of Haiti by 1804, and they had independence. So they'd kind of lost lots of their most important colonies and colonial markets overseas, basically. And all of this was, partly to do with the rise of the Royal Navy, wasn't it? Because they were so dominant in the seas that they were able to defend English trade. So this map, as it's just expanding here, you can see how colonial assets are changing, and you can see how in 1600 and after that you do see French colonial assets increase, particularly in America. Its height being 1754, before the end of the 7 Years' War. But then you can see by 1822, actually, the French have lost interest in North America. It does increase later on, obviously, in the scramble for Africa in the 19th century. But the key point there was that France does not have those overseas markets that Britain has. And we've been talking about the economy, but in terms of finance, France has also got some disadvantages. Okay, so what you'll go on to cover in the British side of the course is the idea that by the time you get to the late 17th century, with the monarchy under William and Mary, these foreign monarchs, William of Orange from the Netherlands, what you actually see is a whole change in the nature of the way the state is organised. The whole relationship between the monarchy and the government offices and parliament is completely changed. So what you see is you have a financial revolution where you have much more direct taxation. That had been one of the key causes of the whole conflict in the 17th century. But this is paid for by a new land tax in 1792 and a window tax in 1707. The population was being taxed at a much more widespread rate, and we know that this didn't happen in France until 1790. They didn't create a land tax. Okay, so we've got some financial innovations here. Another really important one is the Bank of England. Okay, so again, following the Glorious Revolution in the reign of William and Mary, the Bank of England was created, and that was to underwrite government loans by Parliament. So the government could take out money from financiers in the Bank of England, and that would be paid back. It would be guaranteed to be paid back by Parliament, and it also began issuing paper money. and that meant that there was a more ready supply of funding available. And we know as well that the banking industry was at its height in places like Britain, but it was mainly in Amsterdam, and it was this kind of like Dutch innovation of having sort of banks organised to finance to fund public debt that was brought over to Britain because of William III, William of Orange, and then that enabled them to have a ready means of funding the government, but also for allowing entrepreneurs to raise money for investment in things like industry. Okay, so we've had a bit of a recap about the different the context of the economy at this time. Can you just pause the video now and think about, okay, we know then that Britain was definitely ahead of the French by the late 18th century. Can you just pause the video and just have a go at trying to put down some of the ideas of things you could remember that happened in these three periods? What was attempted in these three periods in order to try and change the economy? So pause the video and have a go at that for 5 minutes now. Okay, let's go through the answers. So obviously there's huge amounts you could say here, and I'm not going to read it all out because it's a recap of things that we've already covered in great detail. We know that the biggest problem in the Ancien regime was a lack of revenue, and indirect taxation made up 74%, which, as we can see from when we talked about Great Britain in comparison, who had a land tax. This was going to mean that there was less revenue available to the government to do things like fight wars, but also to invest. And we know that it was still a feudal society with lots of privileges which exempted the higher classes from taxation. And there was, lots of corruption. There was not like a professional civil service that you had in Britain from the late 17th century that were administered the government finances. It was given out to these customs farmers who were like middlemen who were very corrupt. And so all of this led to the balance of payments crisis. France didn't have enough money, did it? They were also suspicious of paper currency because of this scheme by John Law that had gone very wrong at the start of the 18th century. So there wasn't much ability to lend money from anywhere in France in order to finance entrepreneurial ventures. We know it was an agricultural economy, and we know that because Britain was industrialising, when they made that Treaty of Eden in 1786, the French markets were flooded, and that was one of the reasons that contributed to the acute financial crisis in 1787-89. And we know that there have been attempts to implement some of the more laissez-faire economics, some of the more capitalist ideas, maybe even physiocrat ideas, that were working quite well in Britain by people like Turgot and Necker, and even to a certain extent Calonne, but that had been met with quite a lot of opposition, hadn't it, by even from the peasants because of prices, from the guilds who didn't want to give up their privileges, and from the notables and the parliaments who refused to accept this land tax, leading to the whole revolution. And we know that persistent harvest failures were a kind of continual problem. We had that quote, didn't we? I defy you to incite revolution on a full stomach. So the French economy was lagging behind. There wasn't much chance to gain much money from it by the government. So in the revolution, we know that they did try to innovate. They created a paper currency based on the church land. They removed the old indirect taxes and they replaced these with land tax. They deregulated the grain trade and tariffs. And they sold off lots of this new bien nationaux, this church land, to the new bourgeoisie who became landowners. But they did curtail workers' rights, didn't they, through things like the livret, that kind of record of employment that had to be carried, and Le Chapelier law. They tried to get rid of feudalism. Well, they did get rid of feudalism in France, which was to try and end all these privileges and these kind of feudal obligations, which was making life quite miserable for the peasantry. But food shortages, high prices and grain hoarding persisted. And this was partly as a result of France being at war from 1792. And it was because of this that we had all those, the economic terror, where the sans-culottes petitioned the leaders of the National Convention to introduce the maximum, i.e. price control. So there had been reform in this period, but it hadn't been necessarily successful in improving the economic situation for the poorest, had it. And then in the directory we said that they got rid of some things like price control, but there was kind of major economic problems, weren't there, to do with the currency and the fact that it lost its value. And they kind of ended up not paying off their creditors, which lost them support. And they inherited a terrible financial situation, and this was even made worse by the fact that they were being blockaded by the British. And this was all quite negative. There were some positive things because Vincent Ramel tried to introduce new weights and measures, and they did balance the budget initially. But ultimately, the cost of war and the idea that they were going to fund war on seizing art treasures and grain imports was actually not sustainable. And so by 1799, in the context of worse harvests again, they had to introduce another forced loan of the noble people in France, again alienating them and showing that they hadn't resolved the underlying balance of payments crisis that existed. So the key issues that we're seeing persist in France even by 1799 are getting enough money, revenue, what taxation you should have, and is it enough to fund the government? The currency, industrialisation has still not taken place, and agriculture around food supply and the kind of question over whether you should have price controls if the food supply is insufficient. Okay, so it's just a little thought here, based on what you know about the context of France by 1800 that we just talked about. How successful do you think the economy will be under Napoleon? So I'll just give you a chance to have a think about that. So stop the video and write down your ideas and then come back and see what I think about it. Okay, so you might have written something down that's quite negative, and I would agree with you. I'd say that in the face of all this and the head start that Britain had in terms of industrialisation, and the fact that we know that Napoleon is at war pretty much entirely for the whole time of the First French Empire, it's going to mean that it's going to be a hard ask, isn't it? He's inherited a pretty poor situation, and it's going to be difficult for him to resolve that whilst being at war against the biggest economic power in the world, Great Britain. So the big kind of problems are still very focused on farming, which was very low standard of living, and although lots of the bourgeoisie had invested in land and farming, they weren't that interested in investing in industry. It was just looked down on in France, and there was not a great incentive for it because it was so unpredictable. It wasn't a guaranteed investment that land was. We said communications were still poor. There hadn't been much in ways of introducing a network of canals or rivers to help spread trade around the country. And industrial work was still seen as unattractive, and the army was another opportunity for people to do if they were, in lower class. That was more attractive than working in a factory. And because they were at war, there was the opportunity to expand in war-based industries, but not necessarily in other areas. And as we said, lots of farms were very unprofitable. So, Napoleon becomes first consul with only a few thousand francs in the treasury, and they've got 450 million francs worth of debt, so it might be worth writing that down on your sheet. Now, Napoleon recognised that he didn't have the skills to do much about the economy. He didn't take the personal interest in it that he perhaps did with things like the law and the Napoleonic Code. So he appointed Francois Babet Marbois in charge of the treasury. which was responsible for government spending, and Martin Godin in charge of the finances, in charge of tax collection. So you can see you've got much clearer delineation, you've got much clearer administrative roles of the different departments in France to do this. And these people were in office for most of Napoleon's empire. So we're going to move on to task 3, which is the crux of the issue really, which is how successful was Napoleon in solving France's economic issues. Okay, so I'm going to talk through these things. You should be able to make some notes on your grid on the sheet for positives and negatives in each area and whether you think overall he was a success. So we're going to start off by looking at taxation. So we could say that there were many successes in terms of taxation. From 1807 they drew up a new cadastre, a land register organised by Godin, and this was to make sure that tax had been fairly assessed and that wealthy landowners were paying their fair share. And this meant that you had greater revenue from land tax that made up now 29% of government income. Official land tax collectors were appointed, and they had a salary, and they had to show receipts to show that there wasn't any corruption. You also had a kind of audit office, the Cour des Comptes, set up in 1807, which was a central bureau for handling the budget to make sure that it was correctly allocated. And we could say that taxation was much more effective in Napoleonic France at gaining revenue for the government. It increased 400% in these years, and it was 25%. Sorry, indirect taxes increased 400% and was 25% of the income. So we've got much more revenue from land tax and direct taxation, but much more revenue from indirect taxes as well. So there's a lot of positives here. There are a few negatives as well. So you've got the fact that it took a long time to actually finish this new cadastre. It was actually only a fifth of the country done. So it might look really impressive to actually finally reassess all these taxes, but actually only a fifth of the country was actually ever completed. And generally I'd say that a lot of these indirect taxes created a bit of hostility, because they were created because Napoleon didn't want to alienate his supporters with direct taxes, because that would fall onto the wealthier classes who he was relying on to support his regime. So what he did is he reintroduced things such as a tax on salt, tobacco, alcohol, playing cards, and that hit the working classes. And as we know, he was at war, so expenditure was really high in Napoleonic France. 700 million francs increased between 1806 to 1,000 million by 1813. So this is, mainly to fund things like the Grande Armée and his campaigns. So that is going to put a huge financial burden on the population, isn't this? And although he did partially fund this by imposing levies on defeated territories, after 1813, when he became less successful, this completely collapsed. This whole idea didn't have that source of income. And we could say that because he was always at war, he never balanced the budget. Generally when countries are at war, people aren't spending, are they? So it was a reduction in the demand because of war, and the fact that you had all these soldiers taken out of France as well was not good for the economy. So in terms of taxation, I think I might be tempted to give him, maybe a sort of 6 out of 10 here, because he does create lots of taxes, but it doesn't keep up with expenditure, and it's much better organised, isn't it? Problem 2, money supply. So there had been, as we said, lots of hesitancy about the whole idea of a paper currency in France because of John Law's paper currency system that kind of completely collapsed at the start of the 18th century, which destroyed confidence in it. Now, Napoleon's, one of his oftentimes stated important moves was that he created the Banque de France. Even the word banque was controversial in France, in all of these schemes to introduce sort of financing in France up to this point had been called a casse rather than a banque. So in 1800 he created this, which was kind of a really sort of important propaganda move as well. It did follow on from some innovations that had been going on during the Directory to organise financing the government. But this was an officially state, it was an official state bank. And they issued paper currency, as you can see on the previous slide, featuring Napoleon. And it also meant that they could provide credit to the government and entrepreneurs that wanted to set up businesses and industry and expand. And they produced and controlled this national currency, the franc de Germinal. Okay, so franc is kind of a general term for French currency. It was like the term that was the actual coin that they had, that had existed for a long time, when it had been the livre that was the French currency. But the franc de Germinal is now the official currency of France, and it became the basis of the whole monetary system, because it was guaranteed by the Banque de France to be a certain ratio of gold to silver, and that stabilised it, because it put people's faith in this new currency and meant that people were willing to trade and they were happy to do business with France. Now there are some downsides here, because clearly these financiers are going to have quite a lot of influence. They'd supported Napoleon becoming first consul in 1799, and these small money lenders do have quite a lot of influence, and he's kind of sort of beholden to them to a certain extent. And when they at one point lend out too much money, and as a sort of banking crisis, it does put the French state in a bit of a difficult position, and there's a crisis associated with that. And we could say, in terms of the money supply, that inflation didn't go away. They were in debt after 1810, and there was, as I said, sort of a kind of crisis of banking after that point, because they had overinvested their money. So in terms of the money supply, I think you could probably say that this was one of his more successful things, because the government now had a source of revenue, didn't they, in order to borrow from, and this is how he financed all his wars, as well as the higher taxation. And the currency had been a persistent problem, hadn't it? So I think we could probably give him like a 7 out of 10 for this one. Coming on to industry, which is pretty complicated. You can see him here looking at some new technological machines. I think it's a silk weaving machine, you can see from here, which he was very interested in. So he was very keen to modernise. He had lots of data gathered on agriculture and commerce, on industry. He set up this Société d'encouragement pour l'industrie, which kind of gave prizes for people that were entrepreneurs and innovating in industry, to try and raise the profile of it in France, I suppose. And he also created these chambers of commerce, which are like organisations to further the interest of business, to ensure practices are abided by, and there's things like competition, etc. And we do see some industrialisation during Napoleon's France. So you see that there's lots more cotton firms. Now, interesting, I haven't called them factories, I'll come on to that in a minute. But this was from a very low base, okay? And, clearly the big cotton mills are in Britain. There is some benefit from the fact that they're at war with Britain, because, and as we'll talk about the continental system in a minute, there's no competition from the cheap British cloth, because they are not trading with them. You've got more trade and industrialisation in terms of iron and coal, because the war, so there's like big demand for weapons. And Jean-Antoine Chaptal, who was appointed Minister of the Interior, he encouraged mass production of consumer goods, like in the picture we just looked at a second ago. Things like the silk industry was patronised by the government at this point, because it was seen to be this sort of glamorous symbol of French industrial might. So export of the silk industry increased quite a substantial amount, 24 million francs to 64 million. And, yield from the wool industry similarly did go up. So we have a bit of industrialisation. But as I said before, I hinted at a minute ago, this was not industrialisation in the style that we might think of in terms of British industrialisation. Much of this production was still small-scale cottage industries, which is obviously less productive, makes the produce less lucrative. It's more expensive to produce. Even in things like the weapons industry, old styles of smelting in the iron industry remained. And just things like fashion had an impact. So you had things like cotton dresses being much more fashionable at this point in history. You think about Jane Austen, the Regency period. The fashionable item of clothing is the muslin empire line dress, isn't it? That Lizzie Bennet in Pride and Prejudice wears. So linen, silk and wool, to a certain extent, they've kind of gone out of fashion, which doesn't help French industry at all, really, in terms of exporting abroad. So in general, they just lag behind Britain. They don't have as much industry. They don't have as an advanced industry. They don't have any market for their industry because they don't have any colonies to the same extent. And because of that precariousness of industry in France, you don't have much incentive for workers to go to towns, to become cities, to work in industrial settings. And because you had a war, there is actually a shortage of workers because of conscription going on. So Rees says France had still not experienced an industrial revolution by 1815. So it's pretty damning there. I mean, Cobham is even more damning. The only trade that prospered in France was smuggling. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. We'll talk about trade. And I think that Rees and Stiles say that that's probably a bit harsh. There had been improvements in industrialisation. The problem was that Britain was so far ahead by 1800. So there's an element of whatever Napoleon had done, he was never gonna catch up with Britain here. So I think I'd probably want to give him lower here, maybe a kind of 5 out of 10 for industrialisation, because there has been some change, hasn't there? It's just not comparative to across the water. Which brings us to agriculture. So we could say that in some ways, again, there was a focus on new ideas and trying to share ideas through agricultural associations about animal breeding and new techniques for crop rotation that had been done in Britain. And one of the things that they did was they actually sort of pioneered replacement crops because they didn't have tobacco and sugar from the sort of colonies from the Americas. And sugar was even prohibited from being imported from 1813. They had to kind of pioneer the replacement crops of things like sort of different ways of creating like sugar beet rather than cane sugar to get the same sort of products in France. And in the early part of Napoleon's empire, there was some good harvest, but that was probably quite a lot due to sort of luck rather than any sort of calculated changes that they brought about to the agricultural system. Wine production increased, but there's clearly quite a lot of negatives here. So agriculture is still what the French colony is mainly about, and in terms of yield, there hadn't been a huge increase in yield. It was still in the hands of small producers, and this was exacerbated, like I said earlier, by the fact that the civil code protected partage. So when a landowner died, it would be distributed the land between the children fairly. So there wasn't these large-scale mechanised farms with high yield in France that there was in Britain by this point. And these replacement crops were not necessarily that successful. The targets for creating them weren't met, which meant a decline in the standard of living. And some sort of reports from the time that actually the agriculture was doing really well, that butter and cheese, etc., have been exported abroad, were probably actually just made up to try as a sort of propaganda to keep morale high during this situation of war. And harvests kind of were bad again in the later part of Napoleon's empire. So after 1809, they pretty bad, and there was a real crisis in 1811 where the food prices went up sort of by 50% in most areas, and they had to reintroduce sort of grain controls and price controls. So I don't think there's any sense here that and Napoleon solved the agricultural problems in France is there. So I think, you know, maybe we could give him 3 out of 10 for this. Which brings us on to trade. So what I would like you to do here, a bit of a break from me talking, is to go to this clip on YouTube, which is an interesting clip, but I recommend you only watch the first 4 minutes. It's an alternative version of history, so you'll understand in a minute when you watch it. And can you just try and watch and understand, if you can, what was the continental system's aims? How was it supposed to work? And why did it ultimately fail? So pause the video now, go to YouTube, watch this clip and find out about the continental system. Okay, so hopefully you've gained a bit of understanding about the continental system from watching that video. So the whole idea of the continental system was to unify the empire and create sort of a European trading bloc which froze Britain out, to stop Britain from being able to trade with the European mainland, which would bring them to their knees and put economic pressure on them to make peace with France. Now, ultimately, as we will see in a minute, that had lots and lots of problems associated with it. But there were some successes of the in terms of trade for Napoleon. Remember we said that earlier he only kept hold of the Louisiana in terms of the French assets in North America after the 7 Years' War. Well, this was sold off to the American colonists, the American patriots, the Americans, for 50 million francs and cancellation of the 18 million francs of debt that they owed. So this was helpful because it obviously provided lots of revenue for France. And if you look at the map, you can see circled Alsace and Strasbourg. So, you know, think about places in France that are going to benefit from a greater focus and patronage of European trade networks and only trading over land. Then those areas of France did better and thrived under the new continental system. Areas of the France that didn't do so well, you can see circled on the map, like Le Havre, Marseille, Rouen. They really were really sort of ruined by the continental system because they weren't able to trade in the way that they had done previously. And ultimately, like you might have got the idea of from the video, the continental system was a bit of a failure. It wasn't perhaps as much of a complete failure as has been always suggested. There was one point where it did look like it was having an influence on British trade, and Britain had to take out lots of loans at one point. But in general, overall it did not succeed. And this is because Britain just had too many assets already. It didn't need to trade with mainland Europe, as it said in the video. It didn't need, to have all these other allegiances with other countries in Europe when it had all the colonies overseas to trade with. It had, like it said in the video, its own continent pretty much, just spread out around the world, and the might of the British Navy and all the shipping in order to support that. And in some ways, like actually not trading with Britain actually hurt French industry. So things like shipbuilding and rope making declined. The linen industry, because they relied on overseas markets, so it meant that they couldn't pursue the things that had already been successful in France anymore. And because of this, Napoleon later on, after 1810, was allowed to have some licensed trade with Britain because it was not working. It was actually hurting the French colonies. It had not brought Britain to its knees, and it actually hurt France more. And ultimately, it has big repercussions because, as it alluded to quite heavily on the video, it was too controversial, and many of the other states in Europe, even places that were ruled by Napoleon's own family, his brother King Louis of Holland, did not abide by the continental system. So the smuggling was rife, which undermined the whole idea in the first place. But it was a dispute over the continental system that eventually, as it said in the video, leads Napoleon to conflict in Russia, which is the kind of, really important mistake that he makes in ending up fighting a war on two fronts from 1812. So in terms of trade, I think it was a good idea in some respects, and if you'd watched more of the video, you maybe went on to say how it could have been better. But I think you probably have to say that again, this is very low. This is maybe sort of like a 2 or a 3, because it was a bad thing, wasn't it? It was not only was it not improving, but it actually made it worse. So coming to the end of the lesson, I just want to have a think about reaching a judgment on this issue. How successful was Napoleon in improving the economy? So we can look at this in two ways. In terms of solving French economic problems, and so in terms of like increasing trade networks, improving industry, making agriculture more productive, I think he clearly did not do any of those things. There was some successes, wasn't there, to do with economic problems in terms of taxation and creating a stable currency. But I think we would say that perhaps there were still widespread economic problems in France, and they were actually increasing economic problems, weren't there? Actually, things got worse after 1806, and certainly things were worse by the end of his time as emperor. And so there's kind of a bit of a negative picture there. But if you look at things in another way, in terms of ensuring financial stability, I think you could maybe paint a more positive picture, couldn't you? Because there was financial stability. You had the Bank of France, you had a currency that was recognised, you had a much more efficient tax collection system, a much more modernised taxation system, you had public budgeting. You had all of those things that you would recognise in a modern state. So I think you can give Napoleon some credit for ensuring financial stability. I think you can't necessarily credit him with making a big economic leaps forward in his time as emperor. So was it a complete disaster? I don't think it was a complete disaster. I think that the continental blockade and continental system was a bit of a disaster, but I don't think it was a complete disaster. It just wasn't a success, was it? It did not do what it needed to do in terms of solving the economic problems. But I would also argue that that was going to be very, very difficult to do that for these reasons. The fact that Britain had such a head start, not just over France, but over the rest of Europe. The fact that he was always at war because of that competition between Britain and France, and the fact that he was trying to extend the French Empire, and that was a persistent financial burden, creating huge expenditure, and that was the whole reason why he did things like the continental system. And the manpower and the impact of that on things like spending and labour was important as well. And just things such as France having a lack of cheap fuel, which meant that not only stopped industrialisation from happening, as well as the lack of markets overseas, but also this meant that the agricultural economy persisted in France, didn't it? Because everybody stayed in this very traditional, almost feudal, even though feudalism is supposedly abolished, almost agricultural economy. They hadn't made that leap to the industrialised, urbanised economy that had happened in Britain. So Bergeron sums it up. The years from 1800 to 1815 were thus characterised by a juxtaposition of rural economy of ancient type, hardly yet modified, a seaport economy stifled after a century of expansion, and an industrial economy whose leading sectors could not yet activate the general forces of production. So I think the picture he paints here is that actually of economy stagnating under Napoleon, and I think that's a little bit harsh, but it's fairly true, isn't it, as well? Some of the advances in terms of colonialisation and extending territory overseas that had happened in the early part of the 18th century seem to have gone backwards, hadn't they? And certainly the problems that we've looked at had not been solved definitively by Napoleon by 1815. So thank you for listening to this. It's quite a long video. Make sure you've uploaded your work. Hopefully you've completed this work during watching this video. and I will see you for our live lesson on Wednesday the 10th. Okay, thank you.